To him, I was just a retired shop teacher from Dayton who wore the same flannel jacket 3 days in a row and drove a 12-year-old Silverado with a cracked side mirror. That was fine by me. I'd spent 40 years learning that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who's been paying the most attention. My son-in-law's name is Brody. He married my daughter Nora 6 years ago in a small ceremony outside Columbus, and I'll be honest, I liked him well enough at first. He was handsome in that rehearsed sort of way, the kind of man who always seemed to be performing slightly. Good handshake, good teeth, said, "Sir," until the wedding was over and then never said it again. His father, a man named Victor Callaway, built a logistics company out of Cincinnati in the mid-90s. Callaway Freight Solutions. Started with 4 trucks and a warehouse lease he could barely afford and grew it into something legitimate over 20 years. I respected that. I've always respected people who built things with their hands before they learned to build things with money. What Brody never knew, what no one in that family knew, was that I was one of Victor's earliest investors. Not a large stake, not at first. Back in 1997, Victor and I sat across from each other at a Frisch's Big Boy in Norwood, because a mutual friend thought we ought to meet. Victor had a business plan in a manila folder and a cup of coffee he kept forgetting to drink. He wasn't polished. He was just honest. He told me where the money would go, what could go wrong, and why he thought it wouldn't. I put in $250,000, which at the time was most of what my wife June and I had saved outside of the house. June thought I'd lost my mind. She didn't say it that way. She just got very quiet and started making a list of things we could cut from the budget. That was her way. Over the years, Victor's company grew. The stake I held grew with it. There were secondary offerings, reinvestments, a period in 2008 where I almost sold everything, and a period in 2011 where I was very glad I hadn't. By the time Nora brought Brody home for the first time, my position in Callaway Freight Solutions was worth something closer to $400 million. By the time they got married, it had crossed $800 million, and by last spring, sitting at around 4% of a company that had just completed a strategic expansion into last-mile pharmaceutical delivery, the number my accountant read back to me over the phone was a little over $3 billion. I never told Nora. I never told anyone except June. And June passed 8 years ago. That's not evasion. That's just how we were raised. You don't announce things. You don't perform wealth. You keep your affairs in order. You live on what you earn from teaching and the modest dividends you allow yourself to draw, and you let the rest sit and grow and wait for the moment it's actually needed. We drove used cars. We took road trips instead of flights. We fixed things instead of replacing them. The money existed the same way a fire extinguisher exists. You don't carry it around to show people. You know where it is when you need it. Brody never knew where it was. What he did know was that I was his wife's father. That I lived alone in a 4-bedroom house in Beaver Creek that needed a new roof. And that I once spent 45 minutes explaining to him why I still preferred a corded drill. He found me tolerable in small doses. I could see it in the way he'd glance at his phone when I talked, the way he'd agree with everything I said, slightly too quickly, the way he called me Frank's dad to his friends at the one cookout I attended, not realizing I was standing 12 feet away. His real name for me, I found out later, was the Old Man. Not mean exactly, just dismissive. The Old Man is coming for Christmas. The Old Man needs a new water heater. The Old Man doesn't understand how Venmo works. I understood how Venmo worked. The situation that changed things started in February. Nora called me on a Sunday evening, which was unusual. She sounded careful, measured, like she was reading from a script she hadn't finished writing. She said Brody had been asked to take on a larger role at his father's company, Senior Vice President of Operations. It was a significant move. Victor was in his early 70s now, starting to think about succession. Brody had been working in the company's regional division in Louisville for 4 years, and Victor wanted him closer to Cincinnati, closer to the decision-making. I said that sounded like a good opportunity. She paused. Then she said there was something else. Victor was looking to restructure the board before the succession was finalized. He wanted to consolidate some of the older minority equity positions. Simplify the cap table. Her words, which I recognized as Brody's words delivered through Nora's mouth. I asked what that meant. She said Victor's attorneys had been reaching out to some of the early investors, offering buyouts at a fair market assessment. She said it carefully, the way you say something when you're hoping the other person won't ask too many questions. I said I'd think about it. I already knew what the offer would be. Victor's attorneys had sent a letter to my accountant the previous week. The buyout figure they proposed was based on a valuation model that was, to put it charitably, creative. It assessed the pharmaceutical logistics division at roughly 60% of what two independent analysts had recently projected it was worth. At the numbers they were proposing, my stake would be purchased for something in the range of $1.8 billion, which sounds like a great deal, until you understand that a proper valuation put it closer to 3. The gap was about $1.2 billion. I didn't say any of this to Nora. I just said I'd heard from the attorneys and I was reviewing the documents. She sounded relieved. That relieved sound bothered me more than anything else had. The following Thursday, Brody came to the house alone. He called first, which he almost never did. He said he was going to be passing through Beaver Creek on his way back from a meeting in Dayton and wondered if he could stop by for a few minutes. I said of course. He arrived in a black Escalade that still had dealer stickers in the back window. He came inside, declined coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the particular posture of a man who has rehearsed something in the car on the way over. He said he wanted to talk to me man to man about the family's situation. He said Victor was getting older. He said the business had gotten complicated and there were a lot of moving parts. He said the offer the attorneys had extended was generous and that the timing was good from a tax perspective, using phrases he'd clearly gotten from someone else. I listened. I didn't interrupt. He said he thought it would be good for everyone if I accepted the offer. He said it would help simplify things going forward. He said Nora was supportive of this outcome and then looked at the table when he said it. I asked him one question. I asked whether he had talked to his father about coming to see me. He said his father was aware of the visit. I nodded. I thanked him for coming. I said I'd be in touch. He left. I watched the Escalade back out of the driveway, and I sat at the kitchen table for a while with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Outside, a neighbour's dog was barking at something in the hedges. The afternoon light came through the window at that angle. It gets in February, the kind of light that makes everything look a little worn down. I didn't feel angry. I felt something more like clarity. I'd been watching this family for 6 years. I'd watched Victor work himself into something worth protecting, and I'd watched his son receive that protection without ever really understanding the cost of it. I'd watched Brody treat my daughter like a good decision he'd made rather than a person he'd chosen. I'd watched him treat me like furniture that happened to share family dinners. And now he'd sat at my kitchen table and explained, very politely, that it would be good for everyone if I took $1 billion less than what I was owed. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Paul, and he's been handling my affairs for 22 years. I told him I would not be accepting the offer. I told him I wanted a full independent valuation completed by a firm with no existing relationship to Callaway Freight Solutions. I told him I wanted that valuation documented and ready within 30 days. Paul didn't ask questions. He knows me well enough by now. The valuation came back at $3.1 billion. The pharmaceutical logistics division alone had appreciated significantly on the strength of 2 new distribution contracts, one of which had been publicly announced 6 weeks before Victor's attorneys sent my buyout letter. They had known the value of those contracts when they made the offer. The timing was not a coincidence. That was the part that made me set down my reading glasses and stare at the wall for a while. I want to be careful about how I say this next part, because I'm not a litigious person by nature, and I have never enjoyed conflict for its own sake. But when someone who has sat at your Thanksgiving table, who has kissed your daughter at the altar in a church your late wife's family helped build, When that person sits in your kitchen and asks you to quietly accept less than 2/3 of what you're owed, that changes the nature of things. I called Paul back. I told him to send a letter to Victor's attorneys. Not aggressive, just accurate. A letter that outlined, clearly and with documentation, what an independent assessment found the position to be worth and what my expectations were for any future negotiations. I also told Paul something else. I told him to include a note that I would like to speak with Victor directly, not through attorneys, not through Brody. Victor himself, in person, at a location of his choosing. Victor called me 2 days later. He didn't say much at first. He asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. He asked about the roof situation, because the last time we'd spoken I'd mentioned I was getting estimates. I said I'd decided to patch rather than replace for now. Then he said he was sorry. He didn't elaborate immediately. I let the silence sit. Victor had always been a man who needed space to say the difficult thing, and I respected that about him. He said his attorneys had presented him with a strategy that he'd approved without fully scrutinizing the valuation model they'd used. He said when he saw my response documentation, he'd asked them to explain the methodology, and that conversation had not gone well for the attorneys. He said Brody had been involved in the strategy sessions and had pushed for the approach with the understanding that it would streamline the succession structure. I said I understood. He said the word streamline in a way that suggested he now found it somewhat distasteful. We talked for about 40 minutes. I told Victor what I'd known about his company since 1997. Some of it he already knew, the size of my position, roughly. Some of it he didn't. Specifically that I had reinvested through several secondary offerings in ways that hadn't been broadly disclosed, which had quietly increased my stake in recent years. There was a long pause after I explained the full picture. He said he needed to think. I said that was fair. He called back 3 days later. He told me he was restructuring the succession plan. Brody would remain in the company, but the SVP role was being redefined with a significantly narrower scope of authority, particularly regarding investor relations and capital structure decisions. Victor was bringing in an independent board member with restructuring experience to oversee the transition. He said he was also authorizing a renegotiated buyout offer if I still wished to exit at the correct valuation, or, alternatively, he would welcome me remaining a shareholder through the succession period with full board representation. I chose to stay. Nora came to the house about a week after all of this settled. She sat at the same kitchen table where Brody had sat, and she looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. She'd found out most of it through Victor, some through Brody, and I imagine the full picture had been an uncomfortable thing to receive. She asked me why I'd never told her. I thought about June. I thought about that Frisch's big boy in Norwood, and a manila folder, and a cup of coffee that went cold. I thought about 40 years of watching things quietly and knowing where the fire extinguisher was. I told her that some things aren't secrets so much as they're just yours, that I'd learned from her mother, that you don't hold on to things out of mistrust. You hold on to them until the moment they're actually needed, and then you do what the moment requires. She was quiet for a while. Then she said she was sorry she hadn't told me about the buyout plan when she first heard about it. I said I already knew she'd felt caught in the middle. I didn't hold it against her. She asked what was going to happen with Brody. I said that was between her and Brody. It wasn't my marriage. He'd made a choice and he'd have to reckon with it, in the way that spouses eventually have to reckon with each other's choices. I wasn't there to settle that account. I was her father. My job was to still be there on the other side of whatever happened, with the kitchen light on and the coffee made. She stayed for dinner. I made the pot roast June used to make, the one with the onion soup mix and the carrots left in big chunks the way Nora had always preferred. We didn't talk about Brody or the company or the valuation or any of it. We talked about her garden, which she was trying to start in the backyard of their house in Hyde Park. We talked about what her mother had done with the kitchen herb box she'd kept on the sill. It was a good evening. I've thought a lot since then about what made Brody do what he did. I don't think he was purely calculating. I think he saw an old man in a flannel jacket who drove a cracked mirror Silverado, and he made the same mistake most people make, which is confusing the package with the contents. He assumed that because I didn't perform my life loudly, I didn't have one worth accounting for. That's not a character flaw unique to him. It's close to universal, actually. We are all guilty of it in some room, in some moment, with some quiet person we've underestimated. The difference is most people don't find out the cost of that error at a kitchen table with $1 billion letter sitting in their attorney's inbox. Victor's company broke ground on the pharmaceutical distribution hub in Hebron, Kentucky, the following spring. I drove out to see the site on a Saturday morning, parked the Silverado on the service road, and watched the equipment move. It was loud and muddy and entirely ordinary, the way the beginning of most things are. I thought about 1997, about the manila folder, about what June had said when I came home and told her what I'd done with most of our savings. She'd been quiet for a long time. Then she'd said, "You'd better be right about this man." I was. I still wear the flannel jacket. I still drive the Silverado, though I did finally fix the mirror. Some things you patch and some things you replace and some things you just decide are fine the way they are. The house still needs a new roof. I'm not in any hurry. I've thought about that Thursday afternoon more times than I expected to. Brody sitting at my kitchen table. The way he straightened his back when he talked. The phrases he used, man to man, good for everyone, from a tax perspective. He believed every word of it, I think. That's what made it harder to be angry at him than you might expect. Here's what I've come to understand about people who underestimate others. They don't usually do it out of cruelty. They do it out of laziness. It's faster to look at the surface of a person and file them away than it is to actually pay attention. Brody looked at my jacket, my truck, my habit of fixing things instead of replacing them, and he made a decision about who I was. That decision felt efficient to him. It cost him about $1,200,000,000. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about patience and humility. They make it sound passive, like you're just waiting around, being humble, and one day things work out. But that's not how it actually works. What I did for 27 years wasn't passive. It was a choice I made every single morning, to know exactly what I had, to protect it carefully, to never let the performance of wealth become more important than the reality of it. June and I made that choice together, and then I made it alone after she was gone. It takes a specific kind of discipline to live quietly when you don't have to. Most people can't do it, not because they're bad people, but because the pull towards showing what you have is strong, and most people don't recognize that pull for what it is, which is fear. Fear that if you don't display it, no one will know it's there. I knew it was there. That was enough. What Brody never understood, what I hope he's thinking about now, in whatever version of himself he's rebuilding, is that intelligence isn't the same as education, and wealth isn't the same as worth, and a man who knows exactly what he owns, and exactly when to use it, is not the same as a man who doesn't know those things. Victor knew. That's why his company became what it became. His son was still learning the difference between strategy and opportunism when he walked into my kitchen. The other thing I've thought about is Nora. She sat at that same table a week later, and she looked at me the way children sometimes look at parents when they realize the parent was a full person long before the child arrived. It's a strange look. A little disorienting, I think, for both people. I didn't enjoy that she'd been put in the middle of it. I don't hold it against her that she didn't warn me. She was trying to hold two things together at once, which is what people do when they love someone and that someone does something wrong. What I told her that night I meant completely. My job was to still be there on the other side of whatever happened. That's not a small thing. That's actually the whole thing, as far as I can tell. The willingness to remain steadily, without demanding credit for it. You don't build anything worth keeping by announcing yourself. You build it by showing up, paying attention, doing the work, and trusting that the right moments will come. They always do. And when they come, you don't need to perform. You just need to be ready. I'm still ready. I've got a pot of coffee on, and a roof that could use some work and more mornings ahead than I intend to waste being loud about any of it. Like and subscribe, and come back for more stories about the people who built something real and refused to let it be taken quietly.